Okay, let's unpack this. You know that feeling, right? When you're trying to get your head around something completely new, really complex, maybe it's a dense industry report or you're diving into a new hobby. And the language itself, all the jargon, it just feels like, well, another barrier. It's like this double challenge. You're wrestling with a new subject and trying to figure out the specialized words, maybe even a whole different language. That's exactly the kind of challenge we're gigging into today with something called content and language integrated learning, or CLIL for short. So our mission today is really to cut through all the academic talk and pull out the absolute essentials from the material you've shared with us. We want to give you a kind of shortcut, to really understand how content and language weave together for effective learning. And maybe more importantly, how you can actually apply these ideas, these principles in your own learning journey. Get ready for, hopefully, a few aha moments that might just change how you tackle learning something new.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating about the sources, I think, is just how comprehensive they are on CLIL. It's not just theory. They cover everything from the basic ideas behind it right through to how it actually works in a classroom, the planning, the teaching strategies, even how you figure out if it's actually working, the evaluation part. CLIL isn't just about like memorizing facts. It's more a structured way to genuinely understand and use knowledge, even if the language feels a bit tricky at first.
So for someone hearing about CLIL for the first time,
Yeah.
what's the big shift? How is it really different from, say, a traditional language class or a standard subject class? What's CLIL really about at its core?
That's a really good starting point. Basically, CLIL flips the script. Instead of seeing language as just another subject to learn about, it sees language as the tool you use to learn other subjects. So you're learning history or science through French or English, for example. And it's definitely catching on, especially in Europe. Spain's seen a lot of growth, and it works across different age groups and school levels. That flexibility is great, but it does mean you really need to cultivate this can-do spirit in the students. The teacher's role is huge there, building confidence, giving positive feedback, using interesting topics, and, setting goals that are actually achievable is key. Let's be honest, teaching your subject in another language takes, well, extra planning time, no doubt about it.
That makes perfect sense. It really hammers home that language isn't just like an add-on. It's fundamental to grasping the subject itself. And right at the foundation of CLIL, the materials talk about this really interesting framework, the 4 Cs: content, communication, cognition, and culture. The big idea here, I think, isn't just listing them. It's realizing that real learning goes way beyond just knowing facts. You have to actually think critically about the subject. You need to be able to talk about it, discuss it, and even understand its cultural background. It's this whole picture, making sure knowledge isn't just memorized, but properly understood and, usable.
Exactly right. And to really get how language works in a CLIL setting, it helps to know about BICS and CALP. BICS, that's your basic interpersonal communication skills. Think. Playground chat, everyday conversation. Then there's CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency. That's the heavier stuff, the more abstract language you need for school subjects, like analyzing texts or debating complex ideas. Understanding that difference helps us see what kind of language support students will actually need.
That's a really crucial distinction, isn't it? So CLIL is adaptable, but learners still face this challenge of understanding and then actually using all this subject-specific language.
Yeah.
The sources lay out this vocabulary spectrum, which I found fascinating. You've got content obligatory lexis, the absolute must-know terms for the subject, then content compatible lexis, which is language that helps students talk about the topic in class. And then you've got your more general high and medium frequency words, plus the everyday daily lexis for just managing classroom interactions.
Yeah. And the key takeaway here is that language, vocab, grammar, all of it isn't taught like a separate list you work through, A to Z. Instead, the subject matter itself dictates the language that's needed at any given point. Think about that precipitation text example in the sources. To understand it, students obviously need words like precipitation, atmosphere, humidity. Those are the content obligatory ones. But they also need everyday words like rain and snow. And it's not just words. The content might require, say, comparative structures like droplets become bigger and heavier. So you see how the language needed really grows directly out of the content you're studying.
And it's not just the subject content driving a language, is it? There's also that whole layer of classroom language.
Yeah.
The day-to-day stuff for managing the class, the social side of learning. Teachers can plan some of it, sure, but a lot just happens. Phrases like, good morning, or listen please, well done, time to wrap up. They seem simple, but they're so important for interaction, especially if you're learning the language and the subject.
Absolutely. And how language develops in CLIL is tied much more closely to understanding the concepts than just following a grammar syllabus. Like, okay, present tense first, then past tense. To help teachers think about this systematically, the materials introduce what they call the language triptych. It's basically a model with three parts: language of learning, language for learning, and language through learning. It's a really practical tool for planning language support.
Right, this triptychs thing, it's not just abstract theory. The sources show how it directly shapes lesson aims. It's pretty practical.
Right.
Let's break it down. First, language of learning. This is the language students need just to get the new information, to access the knowledge. So, back to our precipitation example. It's the key water cycle words, yes, but also the language structure used for definitions, like precipitation is. You need that structure to define the term.
Exactly. Then you've got language for learning. This is all about the language needed to actually do things in the classroom, to interact. So language for group work, expressing your opinion, agreeing, disagreeing, maybe presenting findings. It's the functional language for navigating the learning tasks. This is where those BICS skills start morphing into CALP for collaboration.
And the third part is language through learning. This is the interesting one. It's the language that kind of emerges. It pops up as students start to understand new things, develop new skills. You can't always plan for it perfectly. It really highlights why getting students to talk, to try and explain their understanding is so important. It helps them solidify and reuse the new language they're encountering, almost like a bonus language boost.
And because communication in CLIL isn't always smooth sailing, especially at the start, that's where scaffolding comes in. It's absolutely vital. Scaffolding, as the sources explain it, is basically giving temporary help. Aids from the teacher to help students understand tricky content or learn a new skill. The whole point, of course, is that eventually they can do it on their own. It's like building temporary supports that you gradually take away as the student gets stronger.
Yeah, and the materials give some great, really concrete examples. For verbal scaffolding, they mention things like paraphrasing, saying things in a simpler way, using think-alouds, where the teacher talks through their own thinking process out loud, reinforcing definitions, giving synonyms or antonyms, speaking clearly, providing feedback. Then there's procedural scaffolding. The teacher showing how to do something first, putting students in pairs or groups strategically, maybe pairing someone less experienced with someone more confident, activating what students already know, using techniques like think, pair, share, or jigsaw ridding. And lastly, scaffolded learning tools. Graphic organizers are a big one. Visuals, word walls, dictionaries, videos, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and graphic organizers get a special mention as being really effective scaffolding tools. The benefits are pretty clear. They offer different ways to visualize information, which can sometimes get around language hurdles because they're visual. They give information a clear structure. For students, they help develop thinking skills, analytical, critical, creative thinking. And for teachers, they're great for presenting information clearly, and they're relatively easy to adapt or edit.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, because the examples of graphic organizers they list, well, the things many of us use all the time. Bar charts for comparing amounts, binary keys for dividing info, cycle diagrams for processes like the water cycle, mind maps for brainstorming, pie charts, quadrants for connections, timelines, Venn diagrams for comparing and contrasting. You probably recognize loads of these from your own work or study, right? Just shows how the CLIL techniques aren't just for language classrooms. They're fundamentally good ways to structure thinking and information for anyone.
Precisely. It underlines that CLIL isn't just juggling language and content, it's actively developing cognitive skills too. The research talks about this progression from LTS, lower order thinking skills, to HOTS, higher order thinking skills. It's about intentionally moving students from just remembering facts to being able to analyze, create, and evaluate information.
So just to make that concrete for everyone listening,
Yeah.
LI tests are things like remembering facts, putting things in order, defining terms, basic comprehension checks. But HOTS, that's where it gets deeper. We're talking about reasoning, investigating ideas, thinking creatively, judging the quality of work, forming hypotheses, asking what if. It's a big leap.
And teachers play a massive role in pushing students towards high success, not just through the tasks they set, but especially through the questions they ask. The examples in the source material show this well. A less question might be, what is a race? Or, when did it start? Simple recall, but a high test question pushes further. Why do you think this painting is abstract? Or how could you paint these shapes to show movement? Or even, what connections can we see between these artists' ideas? Or how has your own work gotten better this term? See? They demand more reasoning, creativity, evaluation. They force students to think more deeply.
And something else that's mentioned, which seems so simple but is incredibly important, is wait time. just pausing after asking a question, giving students actual time to think, to process before expecting an answer. Especially crucial when they're thinking in another language, right? I feel like I should try that more often, even in meetings. Why do you think something so basic often gets overlooked?
It's a great point. I think we often feel pressure to keep things moving, to fill silence. But that pause, especially when you're dealing with complex ideas and maybe translating in your head, that's where the connections happen. It allows the brain that little bit of buffer time it needs. It shifts the whole dynamic from a quick quiz to a more reflective conversation.
That thoughtful approach definitely extends to planning, too. I mean, all this integration of content, language, cognition, it doesn't just magically happen. Effective CLIL demands really careful, thorough planning. The documents stress looking at the content and figuring out where students might struggle with the language or the thinking skills needed, and making sure all those four C's, content, cognition, communication, culture, are actually built into the plan. Sounds like quite a balancing act.
It is, but it's a necessary one. And part of that planning involves choosing materials that are suitable but also adaptable, and very consciously creating a classroom environment that's rich in language. You want to encourage students, motivate them to actually use the subject-specific language they're learning. That builds confidence and reinforces the learning.
The materials also talk about planning around competences. These are described as the mix of knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed for learning right across the board. They list examples like communicative competence, linguistic, artistic, digital, mathematical, social competence. It really broadens the view of what learning success looks like. It's not just about the subject facts.
Yes, and within that planning, there's a really important distinction they make between learning objectives and learning outcomes. Objectives are what the teacher intends to teach. Outcomes are what the students will actually be able to do afterwards. So, for geography, an objective might be teach students about map scales, but the outcome would be students can measure distances using scale maps. It shifts the focus from teaching input to measurable student output, a subtle but powerful shift.
And they even provide a kind of template for planning a CLIL unit. Includes things like the title, the main goals, specific objectives, the content covered, estimate of student workload, resources needed, assessment methods, plus detailed lesson plans with activities and materials. It makes clear that the goals are the big picture aims, while objectives are those specific things students will do: summarize, compare, identify, and so on. It looks almost like a mini project plan for each unit.
It does. And there's also a useful checklist provided, kind of a starting point for planning. It prompts you to think about teaching aims, what students will learn, the content itself, communication demands, thinking skills involved, the tasks, language support needed, materials, any links to other subjects, and finally, how you'll evaluate it. Thinking through that checklist really forces you to consider all the angles, doesn't it? It must help streamline things for both the teacher designing the lesson and the student trying to navigate it.
Absolutely. So once you've done all that planning and teaching, then comes evaluation. And CLIL has its own unique challenges here, right? Do you assess the content knowledge, the language proficiency, or somehow both? The materials suggest it depends on the type of CLIL program. Soft CLIL might lean more towards assessing language development, whereas hard CLIL programs often aim to assess both content and language, or sometimes primarily the content mastery shown through the second language.
That's right. And the scope for assessment in CLIL can actually be pretty wide. It's not just content and language. You could also be assessing communication skills, how well they use those thinking skills we talked about, practical skills if it's relevant, even their learning to learn strategies. It always comes back to that fundamental question: why are we assessing, and what exactly are we trying to measure?
The sources mention several assessment types that work well for CLIL. They're summative, like end-of-unit tests; formative, ongoing checks for understanding, including peer and self-assessment; needs analysis at the start; and portfolio assessment. That portfolio idea, collecting student work over time, like drawings, written pieces, diagrams, maybe even audio recordings, seems particularly well suited. It shows growth in knowledge, skills, and thinking over time. Apparently, it's quite encouraged in Europe. Gives a richer picture.
Definitely. And another useful tool mentioned are can-do statements. These are great for self-evaluation. They describe the assessment criteria in student-friendly language. So for geography, a student might check off statements like, I can identify physical features on a map, or I can organize information using a mind map. It helps them understand the expectations and track their own progress, which is really empowering.
Okay, so boiling it down for practical assessment. Rubrics get highlighted as really excellent tools. The materials explain two main kinds. First, holistic rubrics. These use a single scale. All the different criteria like preparedness, participation, content knowledge are considered together to give one overall score or grade, like a general A, B, C, or D description. It gives you a quick overall impression.
And the other type is analytic rubrics. These are usually set up as a grid. You have the specific criteria listed down the side, maybe knowledge, critical thinking, communication, grammar, and then performance levels like excellent, good, fair, needs improvement, or percentage bands across the top. Each criterion gets scored separately. This gives much more detailed, specific feedback. You can pinpoint exactly where a student is strong and where they might need more help. Much more diagnostic.
And they even give practical tips for using rubrics well. Make a specific one for each assignment. Give it to students beforehand so they know what you're looking for. Maybe have them attach it when they submit work. Then the teacher circles or highlights the levels achieved, adds specific comments, works out the final grade, and gives the marked rubric back with the assignment. It creates a really clear feedback loop. They even mention online rubrics, which could streamline things too. Wow, okay. We have covered a lot of ground there. We've really dug deep into this CLIL approach. And I think what stands out is that, yeah, it has its complexities, but fundamentally, CLIL offers this really robust, systematic way to approach learning and teaching by deliberately weaving together content and language and layering in that focus on thinking skills and cultural context. It seems like a model for much deeper understanding, not just surface learning.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, that careful, detailed planning is the bedrock. You have to think through the language demands, the cognitive challenges, the right support structures, the assessment. It's key for helping students develop effectively. But, these core principles, managing complex information, understanding the language needed to engage with it, fostering deeper thinking, these aren't just classroom strategies. They have relevance for anyone tackling complex information.
That's a great final point. So maybe a thought for you, the listener, to take away. Think about the next time you face a really challenging project or you're trying to learn a complex new skill. How could consciously identifying the language of learning, the key terms, the core concepts you need to grasp, and the language for learning, the way you need to discuss, question, and interact with that topic, how could that transform your own deep dive into whatever you're tackling? Might be worth trying.